Hey, they say good fences make good neighbors. They're wrong. Fences just keep the stupid ones from getting themselves killed. When the newly formed Silver Creek HOA decided my grandfather's rusted barn gates were an eyesore, ruining the view of their pristine 14th hole, they didn't ask permission to tear them down. They just brought out the angle grinders. I tried to warn them about the wildlife corridor. Now they have 2,000 pounds of angry, horned karma wandering their fairways. My property sits on a geographical mistake. That's the only way to describe the 10 acres of hard-scrabbled dirt, sagebrush, and cracked limestone I inherited from my grandfather. It's a wedge of land shoved straight into the throat of a narrow valley, bordering miles of open state land on the west. For 40 years it was quiet. The wind howled down through the canyon, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow, and the only neighbors I had were coyotes and the occasional stray calf. Then came the developers. They bought up the 3,000 acres of rolling pasture to the east. The land was flattened, manicured, and injected with millions of gallons of diverted water until it turned an unnatural neon green. Silver Creek Estates was born. It was a gated community for people who wanted the aesthetic of the Wild West without any of the actual dirt. They built sprawling log mansions that had never seen a real fire, and they laid out a championship golf course right up against my eastern property line. Suddenly, my rusted wire fences and weathered outbuildings weren't just old farm equipment. They were an affront to luxury. The friction started before the sod was even laid. I'd be out on the porch drinking coffee, watching a convoy of earth movers tear up the topsoil, and I'd catch the site managers pointing at my property. I knew what they saw: a stubborn holdout, a piece of trash in their multi-million-dollar view. The crown jewel of my property, and the absolute bane of their existence, was the barn. It sat right on the property line. In fact, it was built directly into the hillside, straddling a natural depression in the earth. My grandfather hadn't put it there by accident. That depression was a draw, a natural funnel leading down from the high country of the state land, straight onto what was now the 14th fairway of the Silver Creek Golf Club. Attached to the barn were two massive 14-foot steel gates. They weren't pretty. They were welded together from heavy drill pipe and rusted corrugated tin, anchored to utility poles sunk 6 feet into the bedrock. They were heavy, ugly, and absolutely necessary. The first letter arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope. It was from Richard Lawson, the newly elected president of the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. Richard was a man who wore ironed jeans and drove a pristine pickup truck that had never hauled anything heavier than a bag of premium dog food. The letter politely informed me that my property was not in compliance with the community aesthetic standards. I didn't live in the community. I threw the letter in the wood stove. A week later, a second letter arrived. This one cited property values, visual corridors, and a thinly veiled threat about local nuisance ordinances. I used it to start a fire for the grill. Then, Richard showed up in person. He drove down my rutted dirt driveway in a golf cart. He actually drove a golf cart onto my property. He stopped near the barn, adjusting a pair of expensive sunglasses, flanked by another man who looked like he kept a spreadsheet of his neighbor's lawn lengths. "Wyatt," Richard said, stepping out. He didn't offer his hand. He just looked at the dirt on his loafers. "We need to talk about the eyesore." I leaned against a fence post. The wood was splintered and gray. "You're lost, Richard. The clubhouse is back that way. We are trying to be neighborly," he said, forcing a tight plastic smile. "But this structure, these gates, they are entirely unacceptable. They border the signature hole of our course. Our residents are paying top dollar for unobstructed views of the valley, and instead, they are looking at a junkyard." "They're looking at a functioning barrier," I said. "And it's on my land." "We've had the surveyors out," the spreadsheet guy chimed in. "The boundary is actually right down the center of the barn. The gates swing out over our easement." I looked at him. "The property line was drawn 50 years ago. The gates have been there for 40. They stay closed for a reason." "They're a hazard," Richard snapped, his patience evaporating. The fake smile was gone. "They look like a scrap heap, Wyatt. We are willing to pay to have them removed and replaced with a nice 3-rail split wood fence, something rustic, something that fits the brand. I laughed, a harsh, dry sound. A split wood fence won't hold. Hold what? Richard crossed his arms. The wind. The migration. I pointed up the draw, toward the dark tree line of the state land. The air was already starting to carry the chill of late October. That canyon is a superhighway. When the snow hits the high country, the animals come down to find forage. Elk, mule deer, and the herd. The herd, Richard repeated, deadpan. You mean the buffalo? We're aware there are bison on the state land. We have animal control protocols in place. A few stray animals aren't going to breach our perimeter fences. They don't care about your perimeter fences, I told him, looking him dead in the eye. My grandfather built these gates because this exact draw is their historical route to the river. When they get moving, they follow the path of least resistance. Those steel gates are the only things standing between a migrating herd of wild bison and your putting greens. You take them down, you open the floodgates. Richard stared at me. Then he chuckled. It was a condescending, patronizing sound. He looked at his partner and shook his head. Fear-mongering, Richard said, turning back to his golf cart. We've consulted with wildlife experts, Wyatt. The bison stay in the designated reserve areas. They don't wander into populated residential zones. They do when they're hungry, I called out as he climbed into the cart. And they weigh a ton each. Leave the gates alone. We'll be in touch, Richard said. The electric motor of the golf cart whined as he drove away, leaving a faint track in my dust. I looked at the heavy steel gates. The hinges were thick as my wrist, greased and silent. They had held back nature for decades, but as I watched Richard shrink into the distance, I knew a piece of paper and a fragile ego were going to do what a Montana winter never could. I had to drive down to Billings for an equipment auction, 3 days away from the property. I didn't want to go, but a man has to make a living, and parts for an 80-year-old tractor don't just manifest out of thin air. The weather was turning, the radio crackled with frost warnings, and the sky had that flat, bruised purple look that meant a heavy front was pushing over the mountains. The barometric pressure was dropping fast. You could feel it in your teeth. I pulled my truck up the long dirt driveway just as the sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long, skeletal shadows across the scrub. The silence of the property was absolute. But something felt fundamentally wrong. It was the wind. It was hitting the house differently. I stopped the truck near the porch, leaving the engine idling, and walked toward the back pasture. The smell of fresh-cut metal hung in the cold air, sharp and metallic like blood. The gates were gone. I stopped walking. The breath caught in my throat. I looked at the wide, gaping hole between the weathered barn walls. The heavy utility poles were still there, but the massive iron hinges had been sliced clean off. The cuts were bright silver against the rusted iron, the unmistakable work of an industrial angle grinder. They hadn't just taken the gates, they had hauled them away. In their place, stretched across the gap, was a flimsy, decorative wooden rail fence. It was pine, treated pine, stained a light, aesthetic cedar color. It stood about 3 feet high. It looked like something you'd put around a flower bed. A cold fury settled in my stomach. I walked up to the new fence and kicked the center rail with the heel of my boot. It splintered instantly, the cheap wood giving way with a pathetic crack. I turned and looked out over the 14th hole. The manicured green grass looked ridiculous against the encroaching dark of the mountain draw. In the distance, the lights of the Silver Creek clubhouse glowed warm and inviting. I didn't bother going into my house. I got back in the truck, shifted it into drive, and aimed it straight for the golf course. I didn't care about their sod. I didn't care about their cart paths. I drove my heavy, mud-caked 3/4-ton pickup right over the property line, crushing the remnants of their decorative fence under my tires, and rumbled down the fairway. I left deep, ugly ruts in the pristine grass all the way to the clubhouse. When I slammed open the double-glass doors of the Silver Creek administrative office, Richard was sitting behind a mahogany desk, looking at a tablet. He looked up, startled, his face draining of color when he saw the mud on my boots and the look in my eyes. "You cut my gates," I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. Richard recovered quickly, standing up and puffing out his chest. "We abated a nuisance on our easement, Wyatt. We sent notice. You were out of town. We took the liberty of upgrading the boundary to fit community standards. You trespassed. You destroyed private property. Check the survey lines, Richard sneered, tapping his desk. The hinges were technically over the line. Our lawyers cleared it. We removed the hazard and replaced it with a beautiful, modern boundary. You should be thanking us. We improved your property value. You didn't build a boundary. I stepped closer, leaning over his desk. You built a toothpick. Do you have any idea what's happening up on that mountain right now? Oh, please, not the buffalo story again. Richard rolled his eyes, picking up a pen and clicking it nervously. We've had enough of your theatrics. If you have an issue, take it up with our legal department. Now get out of my office before I call the police for trespassing. I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was entirely disconnected from the reality of the land he lived on. He thought nature was something you controlled with a landscaping budget. He thought money was a barrier that the wild respected. I'm not going to call the cops, Richard, I said softly. It's a civil matter now. You wanted the view. You got it. I turned and walked to the door. And stay off the fairways, he yelled after me, trying to regain his authority. I saw your truck. We'll be billing you for the turf repair. I didn't answer. I drove back home, staying on the cart path this time. When I reached my property, I parked the truck and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the cab. I walked up to the gap where my gates used to be. The wind was howling now, pouring down the draw, freezing cold. It carried the smell of snow. And something else. Musk. A deep, heavy, earthy scent that clung to the inside of your nose. I shined the flashlight up the draw. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the swaying sagebrush and the tall, dry grass. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, two green orbs reflected the light back at me. Eyes. I moved the beam slightly. Two more eyes, then another pair. They were standing about 50 yards up the slope, perfectly still, watching me, massive, dark silhouettes blending into the night. The vanguard of the herd, the cold front had pushed them down early, just like I knew it would. They were looking for the river, and their ancestral path was wide open. I clicked off the flashlight. I backed away slowly, retreating to the safety of my porch. I went inside, locked my doors, and poured myself a glass of bourbon. I sat by the window, watching the dark gap in the fence line. I didn't try to stop them. It wasn't my problem anymore. Silver Creek wanted an unobstructed view of nature. They were about to get a front row seat. Nature doesn't care about your bylaws, and a 2-ton bison definitely doesn't care about your handicap. If you want to hear how this multi-million-dollar country club turned into a panic-stricken rodeo, and exactly how much a single buffalo can do to a pristine sand trap, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this disaster unfolding. Share this with anyone who has ever suffered under the tyranny of an HOA board. The reckoning is just getting started. Snow began to fall around midnight. It was a heavy, wet blanket that muffled the world, swallowing the sound of the wind and the distant highway. I sat in the dark living room of my grandfather's house, wrapped in a wool blanket, nursing the last drop of bourbon in my glass. The heavy timber walls groaned as the temperature plummeted. Outside, the world was shifting. You do not hear a herd of wild bison approach. That is the first thing people get wrong about them. For animals that can weigh over a ton and stand 6 feet at the shoulder, they move like ghosts when they want to. Their hooves are designed for the rough, uneven terrain of the high plains, absorbing impact, stepping softly over frozen ground. I did not hear them. I felt them. A low, rhythmic vibration bled through the floorboards. It was a subtle thrum, like the idle of a distant freight train engine, traveling through the bedrock and up into the foundations of my house. I walked to the kitchen window and wiped away the condensation. The motion sensor security light mounted on the corner of my barn flickered on, cutting a harsh, white cone through the falling snow. They were pouring through the gap. Where the rusted iron gates had stood for 4 decades, there was now a steady, dark river of muscle, fur, and horn. The cheap pine rail fence the HOA had erected was already gone, pulverized into splinters by the leading edge of the herd. The animals did not even seem to register that a barrier had been there. They were moving deliberately, heads down, massive shoulder humps coated in white snow, steam rising from their nostrils in thick, rhythmic clouds. They funneled down the draw, crossing my property line, and stepped onto the immaculate manicured turf of the Silver Creek 14th fairway. I counted 20 before the security light timed out and plunged the yard back into darkness. Then the light triggered again. More were coming, cows with their calves pressed tight against their flanks, young bulls, restless and shoving against each other, and the herd bulls, the ancients, massive hulking silhouettes that moved with a slow, terrifying arrogance. The turf on a professional golf course is delicate. It requires constant aeration, specific watering schedules, and customized fertilizers to maintain that perfect carpet-like bounce. It is not designed to withstand the concentrated point pressure of a 2,000-pound beast. Even through the snow, I could hear the destruction. It sounded like thick canvas tearing. That was the sound of sharp, heavy hooves shearing through the frozen sod, biting deep into the soft topsoil underneath and ripping it away. I stayed by the window until the sky began to turn a bruised slate gray. Dawn broke over the valley, revealing the sheer scale of the invasion. The 14th hole was gone. It was no longer a fairway. It was a plowed field. Over 100 bison had settled into the basin of the golf course. The snow had stopped, leaving a crisp, blinding white layer over the ground. But the fairway was a churned-up disaster of black mud and shredded green grass. The herd had found the artificial water hazard, a small, chemically treated pond near the green. The pond was frozen over, but a few of the massive bulls had simply walked onto the ice, crushing it under their weight to get to the water below. They were wallowing. That is what bison do to remove winter pests and shed their coats. They find a patch of soft dirt, drop heavily onto their sides, and thrash around. A dozen 1,000-pound animals were currently grinding their massive bodies into the 14th green, turning the precision-cut bent grass into deep, muddy craters. The flag marking the hole was nowhere to be seen, likely trampled into the muck. The true beauty of the scene was the absolute indifference of the herd. They were entirely unbothered by the multi-million-dollar homes lining the ridge above them. They were simply surviving following a biological imperative older than the concept of private property. At 7 a.m., the first sign of human life appeared. A white golf cart with an enclosed, heated cab came speeding down the cart path from the direction of the clubhouse. It was Brenda, the Silver Creek grounds manager. I knew her only by reputation, a woman who famously threatened to sue a delivery driver for leaking 2 drops of oil on the clubhouse driveway. She slammed on the brakes about 50 yards from the nearest bull. The cart slid on the slick pavement, fishtailing slightly before coming to a halt. I stepped out onto my back porch, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, the freezing morning air biting at my lungs. I rested my forearms on the wooden rail and watched the show. Brenda sat frozen in the cart for a long minute. The herd ignored her. A young cow ambled across the cart path directly in front of her, pausing to rip up a mouthful of expensive ornamental fescue planted along the edge of the concrete. Brenda threw the cart into reverse. She backed up blindly, the cart whining in high gear until she hit the edge of the path and the rear tires slipped into a sand trap. The cart bogged down. She laid on the horn. It was a sharp, annoying electronic beep. A herd bull, easily weighing 1.5 tons, lifted his massive head. He was standing near the remains of a sand trap, his dark, wet eyes locking onto the noise. He let out a low, rumbling grunt, a sound you feel in your chest more than you hear, and took 3 heavy, deliberate steps toward the cart. He did not charge. He merely established his presence. Brenda scrambled out of the cart, slipping on the snow, and ran back up the path toward the housing development on foot, leaving the vehicle idling in the sand. The bull snorted, a massive plume of white steam shooting from his nose. He walked up to the abandoned golf cart, lowered his head, and gave the plastic bumper a casual nudge with his horns. The fiberglass cracked like a dry twig. He rubbed his massive shoulder against the side of the cart to scratch an itch, rocking the entire vehicle until it tipped backward and came to rest at a harsh angle in the bunker. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitterness felt perfect. My rusted gates were gone. The view was entirely unobstructed. Richard Lawson had gotten exactly what he demanded, and the raw, unfiltered reality of the Montana winter had just moved into his backyard. By 9:04 a.m., the Silver Creek emergency phone tree must have melted down. The subdivision above the golf course was a hive of frantic activity. SUVs idled in driveways. People in designer winter wear stood on their expensive composite decks, pointing down into the valley with shaking hands. The herd had not stayed contained to the 14th hole. As the sun climbed higher, warming the air just slightly, the bison began to forage. They moved like a slow-moving dark storm system, spreading out across the back nine. They followed the path of least resistance, which just so happened to be the winding paved cart paths and the wide, open expanses of the manicured fairways. I watched a pod of 20 cows and calves casually stroll onto the patio of a sprawling cedar-sided mansion overlooking the 12th tee. The homeowners had planted expensive, imported Japanese maples in large terracotta pots. The bison found them delightful. Within minutes, the maples were stripped bare, the pots shattered under careless hooves, and the patio furniture scattered like plastic toys. A local sheriff's cruiser came flashing down the main access road of the subdivision around 10. Officer Miller, a guy I went to high school with, parked near the clubhouse. I decided to take a walk. I grabbed my heavy Carhartt jacket, stepped over the splintered remains of Richard's decorative fence, and walked the perimeter of the property line toward the clubhouse. When I arrived, the scene was absolute chaos. Richard Lawson was standing in the parking lot, his face flushed purple with rage and the cold. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat and leather gloves, shouting at Miller. Half the HOA board was clustered behind him, looking like a group of frightened penguins. "You need to shoot them, or trank them, get them out of here," Richard was screaming, pointing a trembling finger toward the 18th hole, where 3 massive bulls were currently tearing up a tee box. Officer Miller, a pragmatic man who understood the limits of his badge, stood with his thumbs hooked in his duty belt. He looked exhausted. "Richard, I carry a 9mm Glock," Miller said slowly, his voice dripping with tired condescension. "If I shoot that bull, all it's going to do is piss him off. And if I piss him off, he is going to run through the wall of your clubhouse, and there is absolutely nothing I can do to stop him." "They are destroying private property," Brenda shrieked from the back of the group. "They pushed my cart into a bunker. They are eating the ornamental shrubs." "They're bison, Brenda," Miller sighed. "They don't read zoning ordinances." I walked up to the edge of the parking lot, staying quiet, boots crunching on the snow. Richard saw me. His eyes widened, and he stormed over, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive steps. "You," he barked, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "You did this. You drove them down here." I did not flinch. I just looked at his trembling finger, then up at his flushed face. "I didn't drive anything anywhere, Richard. I told you they were coming. I told you what those gates were for." "You breached the perimeter," he yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "You took down the boundary." "You took down the gates," I corrected him, my voice flat and calm. "You brought an angle grinder onto my property, cut the hinges off my fence, and hauled away the only thing keeping 200 tons of wildlife out of your front yard. You wanted an unobstructed view. Take a look." I pointed out over the golf course. The devastation was total. Millions of dollars in landscaping, irrigation, and specialized turf ruined in a matter of hours. The irrigation lines, buried just beneath the surface, were snapping under the weight of the herd. Small geysers of water erupted randomly across the fairways, instantly freezing into icy slush. "We are calling the Department of Fish and Wildlife," a man with silver hair and a North Face jacket announced, stepping forward. "They have helicopters. They can herd them out." Miller shook his head. "I already called them. The winter storm grounded all flights. The roads up the pass are iced over. They can't get heavy transport trailers down here even if they wanted to. You folks are stuck with them until the weather breaks, and they decide to move on." "Decide to move on?" Richard looked like he was going to have a stroke. "This is a gated community. This is a secure perimeter." "Your perimeter is a joke," I said softly. I looked at the panicked faces of the board members. They were people who believed that writing a check solved every problem in life. They believed that order could be imposed on nature if you just hired the right contractors. They were learning a very hard, very expensive lesson about the geography they had built upon. A loud crack echoed across the valley, snapping our attention back to the course. Down near the clubhouse patio, a young bull had discovered the massive, stone-clad fire pit. He found the rough stone to his liking. He leaned his immense weight against the structure to scratch his side. The mortared stones groaned, shifted, and collapsed inward with a heavy, dusty crunch, sending sparks and ash flying into the snow. Richard whimpered. It was an actual, pathetic whimper. "I suggest you all stay indoors," Miller told the group, turning back to his cruiser. "Do not approach them. Do not honk your horns at them. If they want to stand on your porch, let them stand on your porch. I'm going to go block off the main entrance so some idiot delivery driver doesn't get himself gored." Miller got in his car and drove off, leaving the HOA board standing in the freezing wind, entirely powerless. I looked at Richard. The arrogance was completely drained from his face, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization of his own impotence. He looked out at the ruins of his pristine community. The illusion of control shattered completely. "Good fences make good neighbors, Richard," I said quietly, turning to walk back to my truck. "You really should have left mine alone." The temperature dropped to 9 degrees below zero by nightfall. The wind stopped howling, leaving a brittle, suffocating stillness over the valley. In the silence, the sounds of the occupation were magnified. From my kitchen I could hear the deep, resonant thuds of heavy hooves cracking through the ice of the ornamental ponds. I could hear the tearing of bark as the herd stripped the expensive imported birch trees down to the bare wood. Occasionally, a low, guttural bellow would echo off the canyon walls, rattling the single-pane glass of my windows. The residents of Silver Creek were trapped. The county plows were busy keeping the main highways clear. Private gated communities were at the absolute bottom of the priority list. They were snowed in with 200 ancient, unpredictable beasts. By noon the next day, cabin fever and sheer panic drove the HOA board to innovate. I was on my porch, splitting kindling with a hand axe, when I heard the high-pitched mechanical whine. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. I paused, resting the axe head on the chopping block, and looked up toward the ridge. A large, professional-grade quadcopter drone was descending from a multi-tiered deck of one of the largest homes. It was painted bright white, outfitted with a flashing strobe light, and it was flying fast. They were trying to herd them. It was a stunning display of technological hubris. A man in a heavy red parka was standing on the deck, a remote control strapped to his chest, steering the machine toward a dense cluster of cows and calves, resting near the remains of the 9th green. I recognized the guy from an old property dispute. Kevin, a retired tech executive who treated every problem like a software bug. He brought the drone in low. The flashing strobe cut blinding patterns across the snow. The mechanical whine grew louder, bouncing off the frozen ground. Bison have survived ice ages. They have survived wolves, grizzly bears, and near extinction. They are not easily intimidated by loud noises, but they are incredibly sensitive to erratic movement. The herd shifted. It was a subtle ripple at first. The cows stood up, shaking the snow from their thick humps, forming a protective ring around the calves. The drone buzzed closer, hovering just 10 feet above them, the downwash from the rotors kicking up a localized blizzard of loose snow. Kevin triggered a siren on the drone's speaker system. It blared a digitized, piercing wail. That was the mistake. A massive herd bull, grazing near a sand trap about 50 yards away, snapped his head up. He didn't run away from the noise. He turned toward it. He charged. It is a terrifying thing to witness 2,000 pounds of muscle accelerate from a standstill to 30 miles per hour in seconds. The snow exploded around his hooves. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, lowering his massive, armored head. Kevin panicked. He tried to pull the drone straight up, but his fingers were likely numb, and his reaction time was too slow. The bull did not simply hit the drone. He jumped. It was a short, brutal, upward thrust of his front shoulders. His heavy, curved horn caught the undercarriage of the plastic machine. The impact sounded like a gunshot, The drone shattered into a dozen pieces, lithium batteries and plastic rotors raining down onto the snow. The siren died instantly. The bull landed heavily, snorted at the debris, and crushed the main camera housing under his front hoof. He then let out a sharp, coughing grunt to the herd. The drone had failed to herd them away, but the sudden violence and the sharp noise had spooked the cows. They started to move, not toward the open draw, but laterally, seeking cover. They surged up the gentle slope of the cart path, moving fast, an unstoppable tide of dark, fur, and panic. They headed straight for the Silver Creek Community Recreation Center. The rec center was the pride of the HOA. It featured a sprawling, heated outdoor pool enclosed by an 8-foot-high barrier of thick, tempered glass designed to block the wind without ruining the view. The leading edge of the panicked herd hit the glass wall without slowing down. The sound of shattering tempered glass was deafening. It sounded like an avalanche of ice. The heavy panes simply exploded under the sheer mass of the animals. The metal framing buckled and snapped. 40 bison poured into the pool enclosure. The heavy winter cover over the heated pool stood no chance. Hooves punctured the thick canvas immediately. Animals began to stumble, their front legs breaking through the cover, splashing into the tepid, chlorinated water. It was absolute chaos. Bison are excellent swimmers, but the steep, tiled edges of a luxury swimming pool are not designed for traction. The animals thrashed, their hooves scraping frantically against the wet tile. The water, warm against the freezing air, began to send up massive plumes of steam, enveloping the entire enclosure in a thick, white fog. I watched from my porch, leaning on my axe handle. Through the steam, I could see the dark shapes of the bulls, using their brute strength to smash through the remaining glass barriers on the far side of the enclosure, creating an exit. They bulldozed through the heavy cast-iron patio furniture, sending expensive lounge chairs flying into the snowbanks. Slowly, violently, they dragged themselves out of the water, shaking violently, their coats instantly freezing into stiff, icy dreadlocks. They left the pool area completely decimated. The glass was gone. The cover was shredded. The water was a filthy, brown sludge of mud, bison hair, and debris. Up on his deck, Kevin was frozen in his red parka. His hands were still clutching the useless remote control. He had just caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage in less than 3 minutes. The herd, now thoroughly agitated, did not settle down. They continued their destructive march through the upper tier of the neighborhood. They rubbed their massive, wet shoulders against the siding of million-dollar homes, leaving deep dents and smears of brown mud. They ripped the gutters off a low-hanging garage roof. They claimed the community. I picked up my axe, chopped a fresh pile of kindling, and carried it inside. I stoked the fire in the wood stove until the iron glowed cherry red. Silver Creek wanted a rustic aesthetic. They had paid millions to artificially sculpt the wilderness into a safe, digestible backdrop for their golf games and evening cocktails. They had believed they were the masters of their environment. But out here, nature is not a backdrop, it is a landlord, and rent was currently past due. The deep freeze held for 3 agonizing days. During that time, Silver Creek remained under a total blockade. Delivery trucks were turned back at the highway by sheriff's deputies. The county snowplows refused to enter the private roads of the development until the herd moved on. The residents were trapped in their luxury prisons, watching helplessly from their windows as the bison turned their manicured paradise into a frozen, cratered wasteland. On the morning of the 4th day, the barometric pressure finally shifted. The heavy gray clouds broke apart, revealing a piercing blue sky. The temperature climbed above freezing. The snow began to soften, turning the golf course into a treacherous, muddy swamp. The thaw was a signal. The herd knew it was time to move. I was out by the barn, inspecting the heavy steel posts that had once held my gates. The HOA's angle grinders had left bright, ragged scars on the metal. I heard the wet, sucking sound of boots trudging through deep mud. I turned and saw Richard Lawson walking up my driveway. He was accompanied by a tall, gaunt man in an expensive wool overcoat who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the elements. Richard looked 10 years older. His posture was slumped. His expensive cashmere coat was stained with mud at the hem, and his eyes were hollow and bloodshot. The arrogance that had defined his every movement just a week ago was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, exhausting fatigue. He stopped a few feet away, panting, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the empty space where my gates used to be. "Morning, Richard," I said, leaning against the cold steel pole. "Beautiful day for a walk." Richard flinched. The lawyer beside him cleared his throat, adjusting a leather briefcase under his arm. "Mr. Wyatt," the lawyer began, his voice practiced and smooth. "My name is Harrison. I represent the Silver Creek Homeowners Association. We are here to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to the current wildlife situation." "There is no situation," I replied, crossing my arms. "The animals are doing what they've always done. The only thing that changed is your landscaping." "The damage is catastrophic," Richard finally spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper. "The 14th hole is gone. The pool is destroyed. They ruined the irrigation mains. We're looking at millions in repairs." "Sounds like a special assessment is in order," I said dryly. "Hope your reserve fund is healthy." "Please," Richard said. It was a beg. The word hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. "Please, the weather is breaking. They are starting to move, but they are confused." I knew exactly what he meant. I had been watching them all morning. The herd was instinctively trying to head back up the draw to the state land, but the natural funnel of the topography was complicated by the random, sporadic fencing the HOA had erected around their utility boxes and property lines. The bison were milling around the bottom of the draw, right at my property line, unsure of the path, without the solid, undeniable barrier of the heavy gates to guide them out. They were leaking back onto the golf course. "They need a chute," I said. "They need a solid wall to push against so they know which way to flow. If they don't have it, they'll just keep wandering your fairways looking for an exit." "We know," Harrison said quickly, "which is why we are prepared to formally request that you rebuild your gates immediately. We are prepared to expedite the process." I laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. "You cut them down. You brought an angle grinder onto my property, trespassed, and destroyed 40 years of my grandfather's work. Now you want me to rebuild them?" "We will pay for it," Richard blurted out. "Full cost of materials and labor. Whatever you want." I looked at Richard. I looked at the dark mud on his expensive shoes. I thought about the first time he came down this driveway in his golf cart, demanding I tear down my life to improve his view. "It's not about the money, Richard," I said, my voice hardening. "It's about the fact that you think money fixes everything you break. You don't respect the land. You just want to pave it over and paint it green." "We admit fault," Harrison interjected smoothly, sensing the negotiation slipping. "The HOA board overstepped its bounds. We have drafted a formal apology, and we are prepared to sign an ironclad easement agreement stating that your fence line, and whatever structures you erect upon it, will never be challenged, cited, or touched by Silver Creek again, in perpetuity." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I didn't look at the papers. I kept my eyes on Richard. "You want me to fix this?" I asked. Richard nodded quickly. Yes, whatever it takes." "Fine," I said, pushing off the steel pole. "Here are the terms. I am building a set of gates, but they aren't going to be wire and tin. They are going to be solid steel. 2-inch thick drill pipe, reinforced with heavy-gauge diamond plate. They will be 10 feet tall, and they will be ugly as sin. They will block your view of the valley completely." Richard swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. "Second," I continued, "I am billing you for the materials, and I am billing you for my labor at 5 times my normal rate, because I have to drop everything to fix your stupidity." "Agreed," Harrison said instantly, practically shoving the contract toward me. "And third," I stepped closer to Richard, making sure he felt the full weight of my words. "You are going to take your little cream-colored HOA warning letters, and you are going to burn them. If you or anyone from your board ever steps foot on this dirt again without an invitation, I will leave the new gates wide open every single winter. Do you understand me?" Richard looked terrified. He nodded vigorously. "I understand, I swear it. Just get them out." I snatched the pen from Harrison's hand and scrawled my signature on the back page of the contract. I shoved it back at him. "I'll start welding in an hour," I said. "Get off my property." They didn't hesitate. They turned and practically ran back down the driveway, slipping in the mud in their haste to escape. I watched them go, feeling a deep, satisfying warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. I walked back toward the barn to fire up the welding rig. It was time to build a wall. I fired up the diesel generator mounted in the bed of my truck. The heavy, rhythmic chugging echoed off the canyon walls, a mechanical heartbeat cutting through the cold morning air. Next came the welder. I unspooled the heavy black cables, the rubber stiff and unyielding in the freezing temperatures, and dragged them through the mud toward the gateposts. I didn't bother looking down at the golf course. I knew what was happening. The herd was restless. The warming ground was turning the fairways into a slick, treacherous bog, and the bison were agitated, slipping in the mud, looking for solid footing. They were looking for the high ground. My scrap pile was a treasure trove of industrial refuse. I spent the first 2 hours dragging massive lengths of rusty 2-inch drill pipe out of the snow with a chain and my tractor. This was steel forged for deep earth oil rigs. It was heavy, unforgiving, and nearly impossible to bend. Perfect. I set up my sawhorses and went to work. There is a singular meditative focus that comes with welding. You drop the hood, and the entire world shrinks down to a blinding blue arc of plasma and a pool of molten metal. The smell of ozone and burning rust fills your lungs. For hours, the only sound I cared about was the violent crackle of the welding rod, melting into the steel, fusing the heavy pipe into a massive, rigid frame. I didn't build it to look nice. I built it to look like a fortress. Once the frames were squared and welded solid, I hauled out 4 sheets of 1/4-inch diamond plate steel. Hey, this was salvage from an old bridge project, scarred with age and heavy as lead. I dragged them over with the tractor bucket, wrestling them into position on top of the pipe frames. I welded them on tight, running thick, ugly beads of metal down every seam. By mid-afternoon, my shoulders were screaming. My hands were cramped inside my heavy leather gloves, but the gates were done. They lay on the dirt like a pair of vault doors. They were 10 feet tall, 14 feet wide, and completely opaque. A solid, rusted, diamond plate wall. I backed the tractor up, rigged a heavy chain to the lifting ring I had welded onto the first gate, and engaged the hydraulics. The diesel engine bogged down, blowing a puff of black smoke into the sky, but the heavy steel lifted. I eased the tractor forward, guiding the massive panel toward the rusted utility poles. This was the dangerous part. The tolerances were tight, and swinging 1,000 pounds of steel on a chain is a good way to lose a limb. I worked slowly, brutally, using a pry bar to muscle the hinges into alignment. When the heavy steel pins finally dropped into place, the sound was a solid, ringing thud that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. I repeated the process for the second gate. When both were hung, I stepped back, wiping a mix of sweat and freezing mud from my forehead. They were spectacular in their ugliness. They entirely blocked the view of the draw. If you stood on the 14th fairway and looked up at my property line, you didn't see the majestic rolling hills of the state land anymore. You saw a giant, rusted steel barricade. It looked like the entrance to a scrap yard. I left them wide open. They formed a perfect, solid funnel. The diamond plate acted like blinders on a horse. If you stood between the open gates, you couldn't see the manicured ruins of the golf course to the left or right. You could only see the dark timber of the high country straight ahead. Then I waited. The sun began to dip behind the ridge, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. The temperature started to drop again, pulling the damp chill back into the air. Down in the basin, the herd bull moved. He had spent the afternoon standing near the wreckage of the pool enclosure, chewing his cud, utterly unbothered by the million-dollar homes surrounding him. Now he lifted his massive head and let out a long, resonant bellow. It wasn't an angry sound. It was a command. The herd shifted. The cows stopped foraging in the mud. The calves tucked in close to their flanks. Like a dark, slow-moving river, they began to trudge up the slope. They moved with a heavy, exhausted rhythm, their hooves sucking loud in the mud. They passed the shattered remains of Richard's decorative fence. They passed the ruined sand traps, and the shredded greens. They ignored the houses. They were focused on the gap. I stood off to the side, near the porch, perfectly still. The herd bull reached the gates first. He paused. He was close enough that I could smell the deep, earthy musk of his wet fur, close enough to see the deep scratches on his dark horns. He looked at the massive steel panels forming a wall on either side of him. He looked up the draw toward the cold, unforgiving sanctuary of the state land. He snorted once, a plume of white steam shooting into the twilight, and stepped through. The rest of the herd followed. It took 20 minutes for them to pass, 200 massive animals, funneling cleanly through the chute I had built for them, guided entirely by instinct and the cold, hard reality of solid steel. The ground shook with their passing, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that slowly faded as they climbed higher into the canyon, blending into the dark tree line until they were completely gone. Silence rushed back into the valley. I walked over to the gates. I grabbed the edge of the heavy diamond plate and pulled. The heavy steel swung shut with a smooth, silent grace, the freshly greased hinges working perfectly. The two massive panels met in the middle with a deafening, final clang. I slid a heavy steel locking bar across the middle, dropping a heavy-duty padlock through the hasp. I snapped it shut. The click echoed sharply in the quiet air. I turned around and looked down at Silver Creek. The golf course looked like the surface of the moon. It was a churning sea of black mud, broken pipes, and shredded turf. The clubhouse patio was crushed. The pool was a shattered ruin. It would take them a year and millions of dollars just to make it look decent again. They would have to bring in fleets of trucks, hire armies of landscapers, and dump tons of chemicals onto the dirt just to reclaim their illusion of control. But as I stood there, leaning against my ugly, beautiful, bulletproof steel gates, I knew they would never look at that green grass the same way again. They would always remember the week the mountain came down to collect. I turned my back on the development, walked into my house, and finally went to sleep. If you've ever wanted to watch a multi-million-dollar HOA choke on its own arrogance, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where the real world bites back against fake plastic rules and fragile egos. Share this video with anyone who knows that good fences aren't just for decoration. They are a necessity. Drop a comment below if you think Richard Lawson got exactly what he deserved, or if you think the Bison went a little too easy on his pristine golf course. Until next time, keep your property lines tight, don't let anyone touch your gates, and always remember, nature doesn't care about your bylaws,